Although the English colonies in the southern part of the North American continent were established first, there had been no active interest in the area which has been known as New England. In 1602, Bartholomew Gosnold, an English navigator, skirted the coast of Massachusetts, gave Cape Cod its name, and later brought back to England reports of the land he had seen. 12 years later, the famous Captain John Smith made extensive explorations of the coast, and in his description of New England, named the area and stirred the interest of prospective investors in the exploration of the area. In 1602, the Council for New England was originated, with a royal charter granting title to all land between the 40th and 48th parallels. From this title, directly or indirectly, came the land grants for all the New England colonies. The founding of the first of the New England colonies, however, had its roots years before the Council for New England had been established. About the same time Virginia was settled, some English farmers left for Holland, pilgrims, for religious reasons. The Church of England, supported by the armed might of the Crown, carried out a policy of rigorous persecution against all groups which sought to maintain a different religious doctrine. Unable to practice their religion in peace, these pilgrims or wayfarers resolved to leave their native land for a place where strict beliefs would be respected. They looked to the Netherlands, where the prevailing Protestant beliefs were not unlike their own. These pilgrims settled in Leyden, Holland, so they could worship God as they pleased. It soon became apparent that Leyden was not the answer. True, the Dutch permitted them to practice their faith, but they were not happy in Holland. They had to take poor jobs, and their children became Dutch in language and thought. Dismayed by the effect their exile in Holland had on their children, and yearning to return to the land as farmers, the Pilgrims took action. They resolved to go to America, where they could establish an English colony. In this one bold step, they sought to preserve their identities as Englishmen, return to the tilling of the soil, and best of all, serve God as they saw fit. Obtaining permission from the London Company, one of the groups chartered by the English Crown to colonize North America, they traveled to Plymouth, England. Once in England, they made careful preparation for their journey to America. In 1620, they sailed on the famous Mayflower for the New World. A second ship, the Speedwell, sailed with her, but was forced to turn back because of the unusually rough weather. When the Mayflower arrived on the American mainland, it was far from her original destination. Forced to land much farther north than they had anticipated, the Pilgrims found that they were outside of the bounds covered by their charter from the London Company. Without charter of government or title to the land upon which they had landed, the Pilgrims took emergency measures. They signed the Mayflower Compact, promising to obey the will of the majority. The compact was a stopgap measure until more permanent steps could be taken, but it was the first example of pure democracy on the North American continent. Having legalized their position by means of the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims prepared to disembark. In December 1620, they landed at Plymouth Harbor. They named the harbor and the rock upon which they landed after the English port from which they had sailed. The party of 101 souls, including 2 newborn babies, faced the rigors of the new land, never suspecting that half of their number would fail to survive the winter. Under the leadership of William Bradford, their elected governor, homes were built. Those who had survived the winter were joined by the entire Pilgrim congregation of Leyden. It soon became evident that despite a harrowing beginning, the Plymouth colony was a going concern. Within 20 years of the first landing, the colony boasted 8 towns with a total population of 2,500 people. While Plymouth was the first, Massachusetts Bay was the most important New England colony. Better financed and equipped, the expedition that founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony was conceived on a much larger scale than the Plymouth group and grew accordingly. Plymouth remained small and was finally absorbed by its powerful neighbor, Massachusetts Bay Colony, in 1691. Like the Plymouth colony, it too had come about because of religious persecution. The Puritans in England, discouraged by the hostility of the Stuart kings, determined to go to America. At the time, the Puritans in England were growing more numerous among the landed gentry and the town dwellers all over England. The discord between the Crown and the Parliament, which was later to erupt into civil war, was growing worse. A group of well-to-do Puritan landowners band together and formed the Massachusetts Bay Company. In 1629, they managed to secure a royal charter to colonize the area and began to lay their plans. A mighty expedition of 17 ships sailed for the New World in 1630. All the colonial ventures that preceded it had been more or less hampered by lack of sufficient numbers and meager finances. Its success was almost a foregone conclusion. Unlike Virginia and Plymouth, where colonists faced starvation, Massachusetts Bay prospered from the start. Certainly, this was due in great part to the mass migration of Puritans who settled there during the first decade following its founding. 20,000 persons settled in the colony from 1630 to 1640. Boston was its chief city. Within a very short time, the industrious and frugal Puritan settlers built the Massachusetts colony into the most important of all the colonies in New England. Its actual government structure was a kind of theocracy, or rule by clergy. Religion was very important in Massachusetts Bay. Ministers actually ruled the colony. The laws of the colony made membership in the Puritan Church a matter of practical necessity, since severe and unjust restrictions were placed on non-members. The powers of the ministers were greatest in the towns and cities, and those who disagreed with them tended to gravitate to the countryside. For that reason, many people became farmers on the land surrounding Boston. This was one of the few areas in the colony which was eminently suitable for farming. Other areas yielded crops, but only as the result of back-breaking labor. The waters surrounding the colony, however, were another story entirely. They abounded in fish of every variety. It was only natural that some of the colonists preferred to stay with the land, although others turned to fishing. The fishermen of New England are famous even today for their skill and courage. In colonial times, their trade was even more hazardous than it is today. Perhaps the most intrepid of them all were the hardy souls who sailed from New Bedford and Nantucket to hunt the whale for his precious oil and bone. In addition to the fishing industry, the sea furnished another source of wealth to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Trade and commerce were always important. Boston was a leading shipbuilding center. Many of the British warships were built there, and the merchant ships which came from the Boston shipyards ranged every port on the 7 seas. Despite the material progress in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there were religious troubles. There was little democracy in early New England. The Puritan religion was strictly enforced and dissenters persecuted. Ironically enough, having once escaped the heavy hand of persecution in their native England, the Puritan colonists became just as intolerant as their oppressors had been, if not more so. Finding the narrow attitude of the authorities intolerable, there were those who struggled against the bigotry facing them. Those who fought the strict rule of the Puritans was Roger Williams, a minister. He was expelled from the colony in 1635. Just as the Puritans themselves had left their persecutors to find freedom of religion, Roger Williams found himself forced to leave for the same reason. He traveled south and founded Rhode Island as a haven for religious freedom. Williams was not the only person of liberal views in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Others joined Williams. One, Anne Hutchinson, had insisted on preaching in Boston to the dismay of the clergy. Her beliefs were strikingly similar to those of the Quakers, who were later to settle Pennsylvania. She brought down the wrath of the Puritan Church. Considerable civil strife arose between Anne Hutchinson and Puritan officials. Therefore, she and her followers were forced to join Roger Williams in his new colony. Her unjust banishment at the hands of the Puritan authorities helped the cause of religious tolerance by creating considerable sympathy for her. More and more people began to voice their dissent and to move out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony voluntarily. At Providence and Newport, Rhode Island's leading settlements, many gathered because religious freedom was allowed for all. The religious freedom which the inhabitants of Rhode Island enjoyed caused men of talent and energy to leave the Puritan colony. They enriched Rhode Island as they might have enriched Massachusetts had they only been permitted to do so. The years that followed saw the voluntary exile of still other potential leaders from Massachusetts. About this same time, Connecticut was settled. Fertile lands of the Connecticut River drew Thomas Hooker and his followers from Boston to Hartford. Hooker and his men were amazed at the richness of the soil. It had been many centuries since their own English countryside had been as fertile, and the new land was almost like a miracle. Farming was important in the new Hartford settlement. For the first time since the infamous Act of Enclosure in 1550, English-born farmers could till their land without the fear that some land-hungry noble would turn it into a sheep run. The climate of political freedom in Connecticut was made permanent by an extraordinary event. The first American Constitution, called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, was written in 1639. The right to vote was extended. Not all of Connecticut, however, was as liberal as the Hartford settlement. Another Connecticut settlement followed when John Davenport founded New Haven on Long Island Sound. In spirit, the settlers of New Haven were very much like the Puritans, only more so. New Haven was the strictest of the Puritan colonies. It modeled its government on the Bible. Politically as well as religiously, the New Haven settlement and the Hartford settlement were poles apart. The former was almost like a kind of religious dictatorship, while the latter greatly resembled the ideal democratic state. The eventual consolidation of the two settlements seemed almost ironic. In 1662, Hartford and New Haven colonies were united to form Connecticut. The formation of new colonies, however, was by no means over. New England's last Puritan colony was New Hampshire, settled by an overflow from Massachusetts Bay. It became independent in 1679. With the establishment of New Hampshire came the end of the actual first stage of colonization. By 1690, Massachusetts Bay, including Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, were separate colonies. Their final consolidation, however, was not accomplished without violence. The New England settler had trouble with the Indians. The ever-growing power of the white man and his increasing encroachment on Indian hunting grounds was the beginning of the friction between the settlers and the red men. Confident in his superior numbers, the Indians struck isolated homesteads, burning and killing as he went. The whites retaliated, and soon an undeclared war was raging. The New England colonies, except Rhode Island, united to crush the Pequot Indians in 1639. Armed with muskets, horse pistols, and sabers, and wearing light armor, the small army of colonial volunteers went in search of their enemies. The main stronghold of the Pequots was destroyed and the tribe almost wiped out. Unable to cope with the superior armaments of the white men, the Indians suffered terrible losses. It would be a generation before they would be able to muster the forces needed for another attempt to drive the white man out. Driven from their lands, the desperate Indians struck again under the leadership of King Philip in 1675 and 1676. Having mastered the white man's tongue, their wily chieftain had taken the name King Philip. He was a natural general, skilled in the art of the ambush and the surprise attack. Although his men still fought with the tomahawk and spear, King Philip was able to do considerable damage. New England's frontier was ravaged. Whole families, including infants, were victims of the Indians' thirst for revenge. For a time it seemed that they would indeed drive the white intruders from the land. But King Philip was killed, and the white man's control was supreme. Without the driving force and cohesive power of the slain chieftain's personality, the Indian attacks faltered, and they were again forced to retreat before the white man's muskets. A new danger threatened New England. King James II of England began to exercise more control. Sensing the coming crisis between himself and the Parliament, the king sought to increase his revenue from the colonies so that he might deal with the threat from a position of financial security. His first step was to plan to consolidate the colonies into more easily controlled units. New England was to be united to New York, and local self-government was limited. Such centralization of power was intended to make the collection of taxes more efficient. To put this new policy into effect, the king sent Sir Edmund Andros to Boston in 1685. A cruel and coldly efficient governor, Andros set about following the king's orders to the letter. His first move was to curtail local self-government as much as was practical. Andros recalled all colonial charters. Only Connecticut's charter, hidden in an oak tree, escaped notice and was saved. The others were canceled, and the royal plan put into effect. However, in 1688, the English revolted and drove the Stuart kings from the throne. Bostonians arrested Andros and sent him home. With the accession to the throne of William of Orange and his wife Mary, a reversal of the situation was effected. With some changes, the old governments were re-established in New England. Town meetings gave training in democracy. Little by little, the hold of the clergy over the political lives of many of the New Englanders was broken, and the spirit of independence, which was to become a hallmark of the New England colonies, began to make itself felt. The confidence of a free man who has prospered by hard work on land of his own became the foundation of the spirit which would eventually lead the descendants of these men to break with England and declare their own independence. Another important influence was the natural wealth that existed on all sides. Most colonial New Englanders were farmers, yet great profit came from the sea. The daring fishermen from New England were known in every port from Singapore to Timbuktu. Their quarry might be seal off the Pacific coast, whales in the reaches of the Arctic, or cod in their own home waters off the Massachusetts coast. The forests, as well as the seas, gave up their share of wealth. Lumber was a great natural resource. The British Navy received most of its masts from the pine forests of Maine. Not too many years later, these same forests would provide the ships which would fight the mighty British Navy to a standstill in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Above all, commerce was even more profitable. All along the rugged New England coast, ships were built and manned. The shrewd Yankee trader became a familiar figure on the docks of world ports, and his canny bargains would become legendary. New England ships sailed to Europe, Africa, and the West Indies, carrying lumber, salted fish, horses, rum, and other products. Although some of the profit from this trade did eventually reach the hands of the New Englanders, much of the advantage went to the English crown, thanks to the triangular routing of the mercantile acts. Technically considered English ships, the colonists' vessels were forced to go first to the British West Indies, where they were forced to trade their goods for manufactured articles made in English factories. As a result of this trading, back to New England came cargoes of foodstuffs, tropical riches, and varied products. Even these, however, the New Englanders managed to turn to good account in typical Yankee fashion. Colonial New England was a triumph of shrewdness, energy, and hard work over a bleak and rocky land. The qualities of tenacity, independence, and courage bred by the conditions of life in New England were to prove invaluable in the fight for freedom from English domination. As a result of their awareness of the value of individual liberty, the New Englanders became the spark that ignited the explosion which culminated in the British surrender at Yorktown many years later. Owe a debt of gratitude to the rugged settlers of New England, leaders in democracy and keepers of our national conscience.